Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is James Madison Part 2. We stopped last time at a very dramatic moment in American history, the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at the Constitutional Convention, which James Madison was the primary mover and shaker, organizer. And they had this, they were trying to organize a national government, a stronger national government. And they had this crisis, an impasse between the big states and the small states, and they couldn't resolve it. And it looked like the whole thing might fall apart. The small states were worried about being dominated in a new national government. And Benjamin Franklin had called for prayer. I thought that was very appropriate, and I think the prayer worked because they were able to resolve it. Now, historian Ralph Ketchum has written, one of the biographers of Madison. He wrote this, quote, "The fearful specters of Philip of Macedon, intriguing among the Greek city-states, and of the recent dismemberment of Poland, haunted the delegates and held them back from the precipice of disunion." Yeah, see, these guys knew their history better than we do today. They knew that the ancient Greeks really were a brilliant civilization, but they had never been able to create a strong national government. And of course, they had the horrendous civil war, Greek civil war between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War. And then eventually Greece was conquered by the Roman Empire, and the Greeks became slaves of the Romans. So these guys knew about that because the Greeks had not created a strong central government. Same thing in Poland. Poland had also not done that, and Poland had disappeared from the map. So this was, they knew about this. Benjamin Franklin, beside calling for this prayer, he also warned that if the Constitutional Convention, quote, "does not do good, it must do harm, as it will show that we have not wisdom enough among us to govern ourselves, and will strengthen the opinion of some political writers that popular governments cannot long support themselves." This whole idea back then that you had to have a king to rule a country, that you couldn't have what we now call democracy, back then they called republican government. It wouldn't work. So they felt, wow, if we fail here, it will just prove that every country needs to have a king. At any rate, they were able to come to a compromise, and they created two bodies in the legislature. The Senate, where each state would have equal representation, and this satisfied the small states. In the House of Representatives, the large states that would be based upon the greater the population of a state, the more representatives you would have. So this gave more power to the large states in the House of Representatives. So this was a compromise. So this crisis was resolved. Thank goodness. It's kind of interesting today if you look at the U.S. Senate. California, with a huge population, has 2 senators. And then a state like Montana, very small population, also has 2 senators. Anyway, they were able to work it out, and the Constitution was written, and with the presidency, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. So this national government was written and signed by most of the delegates at the convention. And then here's a quote from the preamble from the Constitution, quote, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." After it had been, now remember, it still had to be ratified by the states, or at least 9 of the states, before it would become law. And this was the next challenge that people like James Madison faced. But anyway, the first step had been achieved. The Constitution had been written, and Madison wrote this afterward, quote, "The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with a unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it a finger of that almighty hand, which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of our revolution. So Madison's is acknowledging God's help in this whole process. You know, politics is such a divisive field, and people have so many different opinions. And here he's writing about how amazing it was that they were able to come to an agreement, all the fellows there in Philadelphia. And he's acknowledging God's help in that. And you have to give credit to Benjamin Franklin for calling for prayer during the moment of crisis at the Constitutional Convention. So afterward, each of the states, there was a lot of debate in each of the states about whether or not each state would ratify it, would approve the Constitution, whether they thought it was a good idea, and wanted to join in the creation of the United States. And James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were two of the most important writers who wrote what's now called the Federalist Papers. And these were essays which were trying to sway public opinion and convince people that the Constitution was a good idea, that each of the states should ratify it. Ironically, the biggest challenge was in Virginia, Madison's home state, because there was opposition from Patrick Henry, who was the political boss of Virginia. So George Washington wrote a letter to James Madison that Madison really was needed in Virginia, because again he was back in New York City, where I believe he was there because there were so many books to read and also people to meet. Anyway, Washington wrote to Madison that he needed to come to help in the Virginia ratifying convention. Quote, "Explanations will be wanting, and none can give them with more accuracy and propriety than yourself." So this is what was going on. In the end of 1787 and 1788, Madison was busy writing the Federalist Papers, and then he was getting ready for the Virginia Convention, because if Virginia didn't ratify it, this would be a disaster, and this was a real challenge because one of the great moments of James Madison's life, because he faced Patrick Henry, who was very, very popular and tremendous speaker. So that they had opposite ideas, and when the Virginia Convention took place, Patrick Henry was determined that Virginia would not ratify the Constitution. So this was quite a standoff, because Patrick Henry was had a very strong personality. He was the most powerful man in Virginia politics. Very, very good speaker, very charismatic. And James Madison was real kind of a shy, quiet guy. So they had their standoff, and this was really, really something. And actually, and in the end, the Virginia delegates voted to ratify the Constitution. So Virginia joined. So this was an amazing moment. That it just shows that hard work and learning and perseverance and knowledge and study and logic and reasoning are very powerful and important, and patience and humility. Because see, the thing is, Patrick Henry was a great speaker, a very strong personality, but he was lazy, and he tended to, he just relied on his charisma and his speaking ability. And Madison, you'd think that he would have won, but he didn't. He lost. Madison won because of the qualities that he had of patience, hard work, logic, knowledge, and so forth. Historian Gary Wills wrote this, quote, "Good as Patrick Henry was as an orator and debater, he was not a reflective or studious person, and he was up against a man who had thought and debated and persuaded on the subject through 2 years that sharpened all of Madison's analytical power and parliamentary deftness. The tiny David slew the mighty Goliath." Great analogy from the Bible, David and Goliath. When this boy defeated the giant Goliath, because that's how it was. That Patrick Henry was Goliath, but James Madison, the David, he won. So this was really something. And one of the, Patrick Henry was very making these claims that, that if this national government was created, it would be a source of tyranny. And this was the great fear that they had. And actually, this is what we're facing right now, I think, as a conservative. But anyway, Patrick Henry says, it'll be terrible. We'll all become slaves of this national government. It would be the end of the world if the Constitution became law. And Madison's responded, and he said, quote, "Is there no virtue among us? Without virtue, we are in a wretched situation. Without virtue in the people, even liberty was a chimerical idea." Well, I think that's interesting. The fear of tyranny. You can have tyranny in people's homes. You can have a father or mother can be tyrannical. You can have tyranny in local government. And so tyranny is not just confined to a king of a national government. Or a national government itself. So the same idea, are we a good people? If we're not a good people, things won't work out. We'll only succeed as a country if we're a good people. And I think the same thing is true today. This is the key question, I believe, in the United States today. Are we a good people? And if we're not, let's work on it. Let's make more effort in prayer to reach the source of goodness in God and become better people. So again, Madison is the father of the U.S. Constitution, a very deeply deserved title. He organized the Constitutional Convention. He persuaded George Washington to attend. Washington had the most credibility, the most respected person. He was able to get Washington to come. He did all this research and reading of history, and shows the importance of reading history books, because Madison, this was a creation of history. The study of history, that Madison read about all these countries who struggle with the same issue. How can you create good government? And all that reading that he did from the ancient Greeks and Romans and different countries in Europe over the centuries, all that learning helped him come up with his ideas that were the foundation of the U.S. Constitution. He wrote the Virginia Plan, which was his compilation of all the research he did. And then he was very much involved in the Federalist Papers, wrote all these essays to influence public opinion, and collaborated with Alexander Hamilton. Of course, later they became political opponents. And he won this very important Virginia ratification. So that was great, and they eventually did get more than 9. Actually, I think all of the states ratified except Rhode Island. Later, Rhode Island eventually did. So they all joined the Union, and they were preparing. So the next step was preparation for this new national government, and then everyone believed that George Washington would be the first president, and indeed he was. And Gary Wills wrote this, quote, "George Washington was so convinced that Madison was the authoritative interpreter of the Constitution that at the beginning of his presidency he consulted the younger man on all his precedent-setting moves." So Madison had been a huge support. Well, he was a big help for Thomas Jefferson's political career, and before that, really, with George Washington's presidency. Now, Madison tended to work very, very hard, and Washington was concerned about his health in 1788, and he wrote this letter to him, quote, "I hear with real concern of your indisposition. Relaxation must have become indispensably necessary for your health, and for that reason I presume to advise you to take a little respite from business, and to express a wish that part of the time might be spent under this roof. Moderate exercise and books occasionally, with the mind unbent, will be your best restoratives." So he's inviting Madison to come to Mount Vernon and spend some rest and relaxation, because it's not good to work all the time, otherwise you'll burn out. So this was nice. This friendship between George Washington and James Madison. It was kind of sad. Later they became alienated because of the first political divisions in our country, and they were never able to reconcile because Washington died beforehand, before they could. So they were getting ready for the new government. Madison spent July 4th, 1788 at Mount Vernon, and he was encouraging Washington to accept the presidency. Yeah, everyone wanted Washington to be president, and again, he did not want to do this. because of everything he'd been through in the war, and he was tired, and he was getting older. The war really aged him, but he did accept the presidency because he believed in doing the right thing, and Madison was one of the people who really worked on that, trying to get him to change his mind. So there were various elections in 1788 for the first congressional elections for the House and the Senate and the presidency and the vice presidency. And Madison faced James Monroe. They both ran for the House of Representatives from the same district. And so they were opponents here. Later they became very close political allies. This involved giving long speeches in the winter, late in 1788. And after riding 12 miles in winter to his quarters after a speech, Madison had developed frostbite on his nose, and he had a scar from that frostbite. In the years to come, he would point at the scar in his nose, and he called this, quote, his scar of a wound received in defense of his country. So, yeah, it just shows, well, he's kind of, making a joke at his own expense because he had not served in the military in the war, and he felt bad about that. But he did have this scar from frostbite during the congressional election of 1788. So Madison won that election, and he served in Congress for the next 8 years. And he was extremely helpful for George Washington as a consultant and speechwriter. He wrote George Washington's inaugural address. He also wrote his farewell address and the response from the House of Representatives and George Washington's thank you to the response, and also George Washington's thanks to the Senate response. So all this writing that he did, he was a tremendous writer along with Jefferson. And it was said that, quote, Madison was in dialogue with himself because he was doing all the writing. Really something. Here's an excerpt from the George Washington's inaugural address that James Madison wrote in 1789 when Washington was inaugurated in New York City in April 1789. Quote, the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. So the Americans felt at that time, well, we really need to succeed, not only for ourselves, but for the whole world, to prove that it was possible, democracy was possible, that you could have good government without a king. And they also knew that self-government was fragile and might fail, and vigilance was needed. And I think that's still true today, because there are people who again, don't believe. There are people who want another revolution and turn the United States into a communist country and end American freedom. So we have to for their own reasons, who don't believe that we have good government today. Fisher Ames wrote this about James Madison, quote, he derives from nature an excellent understanding, but I think he excels in the quality of his judgment. He is possessed of a sound judgment, which perceives truth with great clearness, and can trace it through the mazes of debate without losing it. He is admirable for this inestimable talent. As a reasoner, he is remarkably perspicuous and methodical. He is a studious man, devoted to public business and a thorough master of almost every public question that can arise, or he will spare no pains to become so if he happens to be in want of information. And Madison would really, there's so many things in politics to learn, and sometimes he would be asked, for a decision or an opinion, and he would say, no, I'm not sure. He needed time to research, because that's very important. We all need to learn. There's so many different facets that we need to learn and try to figure out what's the right thing to do. So after the Constitution was written, in 1790 and 1791, the Bill of Rights was written and adopted, and Madison wrote those. He was very heavily involved in that. This involved freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to bear arms. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And this eliminated opposition to the Constitution. This was one of the things people were concerned about. But anyway, those became law, and everyone pretty much supported the new government, the new national government. And it was in New York City. After Christmas of 1789, the government had been in. They started in April of '89, so this would be about 8 months. And Madison was lobbying Thomas Jefferson to accept the position as Secretary of State. Jefferson had arrived during that year from Paris, France, where actually he wanted to go back. He really enjoyed his time over there, but Madison was trying to convince him to accept this position as Secretary of State. And on Christmas 1789, Madison was at Monticello trying to lobbying Jefferson. John Quincy Adams wrote about these two men, Madison and Jefferson, quote, "The mutual influence of these two mighty minds upon each other was a phenomenon, like the invisible and mysterious movements of the magnet in the physical world, and in which the sagacity of the future historian may discover the solution of much of our national history, not otherwise easily accountable." Yeah, wonderful relationship. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson had a wonderful friendship. Friendship's so important. And these two fellows were very good friends, and they collaborated for our country's benefit. Now, it developed early in the first term of George Washington's presidency, this conflict with Alexander Hamilton, the beginning of partisan politics. And there were different issues about the National Bank and so forth. And James Madison believed that Hamilton was trying to make the United States government too strong. And this was, as I said, the beginning of partisanship. And Hamilton became the leader of the Federalist Party, and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were strong leaders in the new Republican Party, which later changed its name to the Democratic Party. In 1793, there was a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. Killed a lot of the people died, including John Todd, a young Quaker lawyer, and his baby William died. He was survived by his widow Dolly and a toddler John. That same year, the British were encouraging American Indians to attack Americans in the Northwest. So even though we'd become an independent country, but the British were still very powerful and exerting their influence. In 1794, Madison met this young widow, Dolly Todd, and he decided he fell in love and he wanted to marry her. And he started to woo Dolly through her friend Catherine Coles, who wrote this, quote, "He told me I might say what I pleased to you about him. To begin, he thinks so much of you in the day that he has lost his tongue. At night he dreams of you and starts in his sleep, a calling on you to relieve his flame, for he burns to such an excess that he will be shortly consumed, and he hopes that your heart will be callous to every other swain but himself. He has consented to everything that I have wrote with sparkling eyes." Well, Dolly was really, she was attracted to him, and she accepted his proposal of marriage. In 1794, James Madison, at age 43, finally got married, and to Dolly Payne Todd, who was 17 years younger. And this was one of the best things he ever did. And this is kind of similar. George Washington had a wonderful wife in Martha, and John Adams' wife Abigail was a wonderful wife. Very tragically, Thomas Jefferson lost his wife. Now, James Madison's wife, Dolly, wow, he couldn't have found a better wife because she was just a very, very good person. They had a wonderful marriage, and she was just a good person. She was very kind, very lively, very energetic. She liked people. And so they had not only a very good marriage, a good relationship personally, but she was a huge help for Madison politically because, politics is a big, human relations are very important. Winning people over, making friends. And wow, was she helpful politically for him. And as well as being a very good woman who really loved him. They really loved each other and had a wonderful marriage. They never had any children, but she did have this son, this little boy from a previous marriage. Dolly called Madison Coat her darling, her dearest, her best friend. Later, Dolly said this, quote, "Politics is the business of men. I don't care what offices they hold or who supports them. I care only about people. So what a wonderful attitude. She loved everybody, and so she was and you have these different parties with political conflicts, but you have to cooperate. You have to overcome these differences. So she really helped a lot because she made friends with everybody. Her real name was Dorothea, and Dolly was her nickname. She had been raised in a strict Quaker family and was taught the importance of hard work, wearing plain clothes, and living a life with little humor. Now she was not a very good Quaker because she was very open and happy. She grew up in Philadelphia. Of course, that's where I believe where they met, because the capital had transferred from New York City to Philadelphia. And after she married Adams, who was a non-Quaker, she got kicked out of the Quaker church. They didn't tolerate marrying non-Quakers. And this meant that she could discard her somber Quaker clothes. The Quakers weren't allowed to wear very colorful clothing. And so, they'd have to wear these very dull clothes. So she kind of enjoyed this because she really, her interest was wearing colorful clothes, nice clothes, fashionable clothes. So she became a fashion trendsetter in Philadelphia and later in Washington City. She also started the traditional inaugural ball for presidents, and which is continued up till now. In 1795, George Washington called Dolly the sprightliest dancing partner he ever had. Now, when she was older, an old woman, she had severe financial problems, but many people came to her help because she had been kind to so many people, and she was such a good person. So this is an important lesson here. If you're good to people, good to everybody, in your time of need, you'll be helped. In 1796, John Adams was elected president, and he was in the opposing party. He was in the Federalist Party. Madison was in the Republican Party. So for a time, James Madison retired to his farm, to his home at Montpelier in Virginia. And he wrote that he was, quote, wearied with public life. He continued to quote, he, quote, longed for a return to a state in which he could indulge his relish for intellectual pleasures of the closet and the pursuits of rural life. So yeah, these guys, they needed a break from time to time. Thomas Jefferson had needed a break, went home to Monticello, and during these years, starting in 1796, James Madison went home to Montpelier to get a break from politics, and he spent his time. Again, this gave him more time to read history books, which he enjoyed so much. He also was renovating Montpelier, which is also something that Thomas Jefferson had been doing, renovating his home. On Christmas Day, 1797, Madison wrote to Jefferson ordering 150,000 nails from the Monticello nailery. James Monroe had been in Europe and bought them an 18-foot tablecloth in Paris. As I said, James and Dolly Madison had no children, but she had her son Payne, and then her sister Anna was also living there at Montpelier. And Madison's sister Fanny, and then his mother and father were there also. His father was in failing health. Madison was hoping to have less slaves, become free from the need for slaves. And at this time, he had 100 slaves, and he never achieved that. He was similar to Jefferson. They both were against slavery, but they were never able to become free of it in their own lives. In 1798, the Alien and Sedition Law was passed by the Federalist Party, and this criminalized criticism of the government. It was a violation of free speech, and so this was a mistake, a big mistake the Federalists made, and Madison was against this. A fellow by the name of Luther Baldwin in New Jersey was fined and jailed after informing a barkeep that he did not care if cannon fire hit President John Adams in the arse. So this was a big mistake that the Federalists made. Now the Republicans made their own mistake because they came up with this nullification idea that, the states could just say, the law that we don't like, we can just say we don't have to follow it. Well, it appears we're out of time. We'll continue next time. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.